Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg stated, I think it was a bad idea when President Franklin Roosevelt tried to pack the court, and that if anything would make the court look partisan, it would be that. Justice Breyer said that it would be a structural alteration and it would erode public trust if we packed the court. What goes around comes around, and if the Democrats can do it, the Republicans can do it. Even our former president, while he was in the Senate, Joe Biden, admonished FDR and said it was a boneheaded idea to consider packing the court. But we now find ourselves in this curious position where political thought leaders on the other side are actively engaged in this idea that packing the court would solve the nation's problems. I think we've heard from James Carville, like, if we win, don't talk about it, we're just gonna go pack the court. Kamala Harris, in her intellectual stamina, said the same thing a couple weeks ago. I think that is a dangerous move. What is the most, Mr. Ross, what is the most accurate historical lesson of FDR's 1937 court packing plan? What do you think that would be?
I think the bipartisan opposition is perhaps the most important lesson. As has been pointed out earlier, Roosevelt had recently been elected with an enormous landslide. He carried 46 out of the then 48 states. He had more than 60% of the popular vote. He had assembled one of the most powerful political coalitions in the nation's history. He thought he was invincible. He thought that the court packing plan would naturally have to sail through Congress, which at that point was overwhelmingly Democratic. The Democrats won unprecedented majorities in the 1936 elections that re-elected Roosevelt himself. And Roosevelt was stunned when his plan encountered immediate and significant opposition, which eventually sunk it. And the reason was that Americans of all persuasions recognized that this was an attack on the independence of the court itself. And if I could give an example, Gutzon Borglum, who was the Mount Rushmore sculptor, was a political progressive on everything except race. And he was outraged by the Supreme Court's recent decisions striking down New Deal regulatory legislation. But he wrote a letter to Senator Norris of Nebraska urging him to vote against the court packing plan because he said it would interfere with the independence of the court. And he was at that time engaged in sculpting the faces on Mount Rushmore. And he said that if the court packing plan passed, he'd throw down his chisel and wouldn't go back to Mount Rushmore to finish carving those faces because he thought that the packing of the court would make a mockery of what those four presidents stood for. So again, this was across the board, and I think that's the most
Let's play an exercise.
Lesson.
If FDR had been successful in altering the structure of the Supreme Court, what do you think the ramifications would have been at the time and then moving forward?
Well, the immediate ramifications wouldn't have been all that great because although Roosevelt lost the battle, he won the war because of deaths and resignations of justices during the next few years. So within a few years, Roosevelt had a court that was overwhelmingly supportive of his pro-regulatory legislation. I think, though, if the packing itself had occurred, it wouldn't have changed the outcome of the cases that much because the court shifted its positions fairly rapidly anyway. But I think the long-term effect would have been the same effect that as it would happen if it occurred today, which would be an erosion of judicial independence and a diminution of public respect for the court. And of course, the prospect of ever-increasing numbers on the court, bigger and bigger court as subsequent
contractions, right? I mean, we could have taken this, I guess, or Congress could have taken the same approach as Virginia, right? That they're trying to do is, we don't agree with the opinion, so we're just going to sunset you all.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Do you think, Mr. Scher, that expanding the number of justices would heal some sort of partisan divide in this country?
Not at all.
We'll expand on that for a minute. How would that not fix what I'm hearing on the left right now, which is that there's an illegitimate court and it's dangerous and what they're doing is undemocratic, so we can fix it by adding 4 new justices? How would that not heal the partisan divide?
Well, I think actually it would undermine what really needs to be done to heal those divides. And that is because it distracts from the more important projects, as we discussed earlier, of building the political coalitions that allow you to achieve your legislative objectives. You know, we've talked earlier about the Voting Rights Act, for example, and people are complaining about how the Supreme Court, quote, gutted the Voting Rights Act. Well, they didn't do that at all. This body could amend the Voting Rights Act, and if this body wants to impose majority-minority districts on the country or various places in the country, that's something that this body can do, and my guess is that the Supreme Court would probably sustain that. You know, for just about every one of the problems that we've discussed, there's a legislative solution that requires persuading voters and then winning elections,
And then doing
then doing it. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired. I yield back, sir.